Hello, everyone. Hi. Welcome. My name is Denise Cruz, and I'm professor and chair of English and Comparative Literature. It is a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this celebration of criticism and politics, Bruce Robbins' polemical, smart, insightful, and often wry and witty engagement with politics, analysis, literature, change, and critical genealogies. My hope is that you will be inspired to buy the book from our conversation. And to make that easier, the Heyman Center has provided flyers just outside with a discount code. Those of you who are watching at home, the Heyman Center will be emailing you your code. I'm joined by the people you really want to hear from, so I will introduce them quickly in turn with abbreviated introductions that in no way do justice to the richness of their work. Bruce Robbins is Old Dominion Foundation professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia. In addition to criticism and politics, he is the author of Secular Vocations, Intellectuals, Professionalism, Culture, Perpetual War, Cosmopolitanism from the Viewpoint of Violence, and The Beneficiary. His works are mainly in the areas of 19th and 20th century fiction, literary and cultural theory, and post-colonial studies. Amanda Anderson is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Humanities and English and director of the Coggins Institute for the Humanities at Brown University. She's the author most recently of Character, 3 Inquiries in Literary Study, with Rita Felsky and Toro Moy, Psyche and Ethos, Moral Life After Psychology, and Bleak Liberalism. Jack Halberstam is the David Feinstein Professor of the Humanities at Columbia University. Halberstam is the author of 7 books, including Skin Shows, Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters, Female Masculinity in a Queer Time and Place, The Queer Art of Failure, Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender, and the End of Normal, a short book titled Trans, a quick and quirky account of gender variance, and most recently, Wild Things, the Disorder of Desire. Please join me in welcoming our first panelist, Bruce Robbins.
So, am I at the right distance from this? It has a pretty cover, no? It's the single best thing about this book, I will say. There's a story behind it acquiring a really nice cover. People have said they like it. I really do too. I'm afraid that the cover understands the book better than I understand the book. Whatever it suggests, maybe a 60s image of a flower coming out of a gun, something like that. I was sort of trying to be belligerent in writing this book, and I'm afraid the cover is really not very belligerent. You know, so it's like, but maybe I wasn't trying to be as hard to be belligerent as I thought I was. Anyway, I was provoked into writing this book by Rita Felsky, Amanda's co-author, saying in the limits of critique that we've done enough talking about power, it's time to start talking about love. And I said in exchange with her, I quote myself, "A flower can be beautiful. The photograph of a corpse of a child on a Syrian beach, beautiful or not, will have to be discussed in other terms." I was told by the press that I was talking too much about Felsky and I should cut her out as completely as I could. And I took out some of that. Some of it I just couldn't take out. But what happened in the course of writing it, sorry, I'll put this down now, is it started as a rant, and at least a polemic, and it kind of turned into an introduction, because I sort of had to think about what it's a terrible idea, thinking about what makes you angry and thinking maybe it shouldn't, you know, or anyway, it turned into a much more introspective thing than it was meant to be. There is an existential case for politics. You know, you look around at the world and you see what state it's in, you think, okay, am I happy just doing my job as it is and kind of leaving it at that? I mean, maybe not, you know, since I only have one go round on Earth. But I don't make that case actually in the book at all. Maybe I should have. What the book does is show or try to show that there are kind of political concerns already embedded in the discipline, which means, you know, they're not the most revolutionary concerns in the world because a discipline can't be revolutionary. It just, by definition, it just can't. I'm afraid I would probably have to describe, if the discipline as a whole has a politics, it would probably be something like social democratic politics. I mean, you can get up and leave when you hear that. I mean, if that's too disappointing for you, but I think that's probably the case. All right. So the book has a historical premise, and the premise is that criticism is still fighting the culture wars of the last century, which is to say, still thinking through what it has inherited, for better or worse, from the 60s movements, mainly on behalf of race, gender, sexuality, and there's an et cetera. So not so much class, because that's just a historical fact, maybe a sad one, but a historical fact about the 60s movements. One sentence I was unable to take out said that Felsky's complaint about political criticism being negative, and that's kind of a theme of hers, how negative it is. This has like never been true. And I don't know, people should be called when they say things that are just not true. Don't you think? I don't know, I think. That belongs next to Vice President Spiro Agnew's famous characterization of the liberals during the midterm elections of 1970 as, and I quote, "Nobody is old enough to remember this except me, nattering nabobs of negativism." And it's really a good one, right? I think it's William Safire wrote that. So this is possibly a darling that should have been murdered. But these days, with all the ridiculous but politically potent talk of critical race theory in books that our children need to be protected from, and all of this moving from primary education to secondary education to tertiary education, I don't know. It seems to me that there's a lot of visible continuity over the last 50 years. And, you know, we don't want to be self-aggrandizing, but it feels to me like what's happening in literature departments is actually part of a larger political situation, a real part. Again, I don't want to, we're not going to change the world by ourselves, but we are part of it. So political criticism is widely accused of being negative criticism. This negativity is often blamed on the heritage of the 60s movements. The charge is easy enough to refute. A great deal, think about it, of entirely positive or appreciative criticism has been enabled and encouraged by so-called identity politics. It's perhaps not seen as appreciative criticism only because many of the works that are now being appreciated are associated with women and minorities. But the logic is not entirely wrong. Movements on behalf of race, gender, and sexuality demanded greater representation in the name of an expanded democracy. Reasonably enough, they are not always respectful of a past in which they and theirs have gone unrepresented or worse. But methodologically speaking, the most influential legacy of the 60s, as I see it, this is one of the things I was sort of proud of arguing that I didn't see initially, was the imperative to put texts into their historical contexts. So one major proposition in the book is that difference as a motto of identity turns into differences as the content of history, the content of history seen as differences. This is felt correctly as a political move. From the perspective of those who assume that the great texts of the past are timeless, contextualization like this is going to look like negativity, like tearing those texts down, judging the past by the moral standards of the present, pushing it away, showing it disrespect. I myself do not argue that history should be seen as entirely composed of differences, as if a text written on Thursday can have nothing in common with the text written on Tuesday. You were supposed to laugh at that. Okay, I'm going to try to explain that to my. I try to work through this conundrum by suggesting that whether putting text in context counts as a put down or not will depend on one's conception of history. I do permit myself some belligerence at the expense of a conception of history that is organized around melancholy, A melancholy that from the point of view of the 60s movements denies the progress toward greater democratic representation that women and minorities seem to have won from 1970 on, and that ought to be a matter, if not of complacency, at least of a certain satisfaction. So I sort of borrowed from the historian of anthropology, James Clifford, who is talking about the discipline of anthropology. We have someone who speak for anthropology here, maybe more than one person for all I know. The sort of salvage or rescue paradigm, the idea that culture is always on the verge of extinction, and the scholar has to be the heroic rescuer of a culture that is always at the point of dying. That seemed to me so powerful when he first said it. He probably said it 30 odd years ago, maybe more. And I thought, it also sounds really familiar to me, at least from my graduate education. It was kind of a reason why people didn't pay much attention to contemporary literature, didn't need to be rescued, right? People liked it. Whereas, you know, we were there kind of as rescuers. I just skipped out of it. All right, forget this. So another page. In the 50 years between 1970 and 2020, the period discussed in the book, Matthew Arnold was replaced, so I argue, by Michel Foucault as the single most foundational thinker for the humanities, the figure outside the discipline, outside all disciplines, who explained to many of us why we were doing what we were doing inside our disciplines. So I argued that there was a lot more commonality than might appear between the two figures, and between what culture meant to Arnold and what it meant to the 60s movements. One obvious commonality between Arnold and Foucault, which I take some time over, is their shared anti-progressivism. And there are less obvious ones. Fans of Arnold have often suggested that what he was really proposing was a certain tact or poise or sensibility. And his detractors have replied that this sensibility, based as it is around complexity and hesitation, commits his followers to political do-nothingism. Thinking through the legacy of the emancipatory movements of the 60s, and borrowing a little bit from my friend Amanda over here, and yeah, he'll probably bring this up, right? No, maybe not. All right. I came to the conclusion, one, that they too promulgated a certain tact or poise as one upshot of their lessons, that their sensibility also demanded a set of hesitations, and most surprisingly, that it was these very hesitations that define one thing that's valuable and lasting in their politics. Here I could make a little speech about intersectionality, but I'm not going to. Last paragraph. One polemical narrative that I try to answer in the book, polemically, goes like this. Once upon a time, criticism was central to its culture. Now, however, it gets no respect. And the reason is that it has abandoned its core principles, whatever those principles might be. Under examination, the most questionable thing about this narrative is the premise that once upon a time, criticism, in fact, had a mission that won it respect in the eyes of those around it. But if that premise is granted, and I have to say, John Guillory makes an excellent case for it with regard to the journalist critics of the 18th century, then it follows, or so I argue, that a very similar case can be made for an organic role played by criticism vis-a-vis the democracy expanding movements of the 1960s. The 60s movements themselves were extremely skeptical that intellectuals could represent anyone, let alone be organic to any collectivity, whether based on class or not. So in bringing forward Edward Said and Stuart Hall as, I think, organic intellectuals, helping to organize an as yet non-existent democratic coalition, I'm also arguing with the 60s. I'm certainly arguing with Foucault, who refused to think about governing, only about not being governed or not being governed like that, pointing. But that's finally where the book's belligerence goes, toward the ultimate goal of our side learning to govern and to govern differently. That's my intro.
Okay, so it's great to be here, and it was wonderful to read Bruce's book and anticipate this conversation. All right, let's find my talk. Okay, so at the heart of Bruce Robbins's, I'm going to call him Robbins, just because I don't know.
We know each other.
I know, but I can't. I'm not going to search and replace right now. Ain't happening. All right. So at the heart of Bruce Robbins's wide-ranging and thought-provoking book is, I think, a two-part claim, more earnestly than polemically offered. First, that the social movements of the 60s set in motion the forces that continue to define the politics of criticism at the present day. And second, that the politics of the 60s also offer a promising model in relation to some of the excesses or debilitating tendencies that animate the contemporary literary field. In that sense, it is not merely a historical argument, which of course it is, but a generational one and a normative one. I actually found the book quite capacious in tone and mode, only punctually polemical, maybe only vis-a-vis Belsky, but anyway, only punctually polemical in the end, and in most cases quick to acknowledge the more genuine motives or unavoidable conditions which might lead to positions Robbins differs from. And this is in keeping with the aim of the book, which is to persuade, not alienate, to bring on board, not repudiate. You may have felt belligerent, but it didn't come across that way. One of the most interesting examples of this is in the see, they knew, that designer knew. One of the most interesting examples of this is in the close affinity in the book between the terms intersectionality and cosmopolitanism. Robbins is trying to bridge certain differences in the field, though with a specific aim which may make it hard to convince all readers. Perhaps it's best to begin with a brief sketch of what Robbins is arguing against, and then move toward a consideration of what he is arguing for. I'm going to be selective here, focusing on what for me were key through lines, but I do want to acknowledge before doing so that there are other arguments in this very rich account that I will not be taking up, including the nomination of Foucault as the single most important figure for the field, the Matthew Arnold of our day, and the really intriguing discussion of violence, imperialism, and deep history, which has interesting resonances with some newer work on indigeneity. For me, fundamentally, criticism in politics is calling out a certain entrenched oppositionality in the field. So we may talk about that, because you were talking about it's not negative. But it is calling out a certain entrenched oppositionality in the field, one whose prehistory Robbins traces from early cultural critiques of industrialism in the 19th century through to radical critiques of power and instrumentality that have characterized the field since the 70s. These ideologically disparate frameworks all share a critique of capitalist modernity. There is thus throughout the history of the field, then, a kind of oppositional distance that defines the critic, one that stems from the dual object of the field, not simply literature, but also culture. Robbins reminds us in this context that Arnold's The Function of Criticism at the Present Time contains no literary objects of analysis, and that its most memorable act of reading, dwelling on the phrase "rag is in custody," is of a newspaper text. This fundamental oppositionality is also in Robbins's account of affectively inflected, first as melancholy in the conservative form, and then as a kind of pessimism, though Robbins does not use this word. It presents instead as permanent opposition. And here we see a key judgment made. Robbins writes, quote, "A permanent opposition, strictly speaking, is not a politics. The fundamental premise of politics is action oriented toward a different future." Robbins applies a kind of double lens when discussing more recent and contemporary movements. On the one hand, pointing out problems, and on the other, aiming to reframe and rename positions or practices so that they align with the aspirational force of the politics being advocated. One key example here would be the discussion of intersectionality, which he reframes in its most promising versions as a kind of reprisal of 60s politics. Robbins argues that in order to cohere as a movement among many different interest groups, The politics of the 60s required a certain disinterestedness, self-abstraction, self-critique. This he sees as the best potential of intersectionality, not in those versions in which it becomes, as he puts it, a way for one to score the most points in an oppression derby, these are his words, but when it serves to promote practices of ongoing self-scrutiny, capacious understandings of combined vulnerabilities and privileges, and a more open-ended sense of identity and selfhood. Beyond this, it can become the basis for ongoing adjudication of interests in the political sphere. Ultimately, Robbins wants to revitalize Gramsci's conception of the organic intellectual, and for Robbins, any effective present-day concept of the organic intellectual, or he calls it at one point the organic academic, in a kind of oxymoron, must not only, I'm just kidding, must not only, they don't laugh.
No, you're not. Because you're not kidding.
Must not only, okay, I just start this sentence again. All right, okay, with no editorializing. Ultimately, Robbins wants to revitalize Gramsci's conception of the organic intellectual, and any effective present-day concept of the organic intellectual or organic academic must not only critically engage, but also move beyond questions of identity, addressing issues of environmental catastrophe, for example, or militarism or democracy. Democracy emerges as the key normative ideal in the text, and it is the central political ideal, the one in relation to which all the other aspirations ultimately point. It forms the basis for an emphasis on the importance of creating a world in which it is possible to govern differently. In order to support this overarching aim, Robbins insists that a certain democratic aspiration lies behind many of the most energetic and consequential developments within the humanities and the university. Notably, the growth of key advocacy-based programs, that's my term, not his, advocacy-based, women's studies, African-American studies, ethnic studies, queer studies. In Robbins' account, the advocacy-based programs are challenging historical forms of injustice that violate democratic norms and rules. Beyond this, he characterizes the work being done across these fields and in the humanities as a whole as the adjudication of contesting claims to representation and contesting versions of collective self-fashioning. Thus, the practices of the university are characterized as a form of democratic contestation, and emergent fields are coterminous with movements outside the university or the force behind them that fight for civil rights and democratic inclusion. On the one hand, I want to say, yes, this makes sense. But on the other, as Robbins himself discusses, there is a persistent oppositionality that makes this description feel not true to the self-understanding of many of these constituencies within the university. The university has itself become a target for many within the university, with calls to decolonize the university or the humanities or specific fields. And insofar as many of the fields mentioned do not believe in the progressive power of institutions, this feels like a kind of willful reframing of the situation. Robbins knows this, actually, and admits it in the more polemical moments of the text, as, for example, when he sharply points out that the field is anti-progressive, except when it comes to characterizing its own scholarship. That's a great part. And this leads me to remark one feature of Robbins's own normative rhetoric, an employment of a mode of description that does not mark itself as redescription. He goes in and out of this mode, but at moments it is striking in its effects. And on balance, I think it's effective and thought-provoking as an alternative to more apodictic normative critique of the type that I employ. Still, by collecting all of the claims for inclusion on the part of different groups as fundamentally tied to an underlying understanding of and fight for democratic conditions, both the entrenched oppositionality and the internal divisions of the academic left are insufficiently acknowledged. Yet another way to approach this might be to consider what precisely are the key words of the emergent politically affiliated programs if democratic inclusion is not to the fore in their self-representations. Decolonization is certainly one that has had a lot of play. There are many others, and it seems important to analyze the frameworks in which these movements take place and present themselves. My last teeny point. Speaking of nomenclature, I wonder, do the current practitioners within the humanities see themselves adequately reflected in the words criticism and critic? What work are these words doing relative to other forms of self-conception in the field at present, including worker, scholar activist, teacher, and engaged scholar? What do academics identify as qua academics? The end.
All right, thank you for that, Amanda. That's super helpful. This is a polemic, this book, so I hope people will understand my approach to it, which maybe could be characterized as belligerent, to use Bruce's term, because the polemic has to have the premises tested a little bit. So let me apply some pressure to a few places, some of the places that Amanda has actually mentioned, and then let's see where we are, and we can have a debate, because that's the point of a polemic. Let's put some stuff out there and see where it goes. Okay, so the good news is that this is a very elegant book, a very readable book. It's charming, it's funny, it's masterful in its account of the role of criticism as it has developed, as we've heard, out of the social movements of the 1960s. He's Bruce for me. Bruce tells us.
This is being recorded, right?
Yeah, this is being recorded.
Posterity. That's all.
Bruce tells us that in the 1960s, these social movements set out to transform not just structures of governance, but epistemological systems, concepts of archives and canons, and notions of expertise. In the wake of the 60s, new radical intellectuals wanted simply to reinvent the university. And we can ask whether Bruce also wants this. In English departments in particular, which skewed white and male then, and still do now, students like Bruce, and then 10 years later like me, learned how to deploy close readings to confirm, was what all I could come up with, that the canonical reading lists were in fact made up of simply the best and the brightest material produced over time. Context was irrelevant to these close readings because the text simply generated all that you needed to know. Conveniently for the white guys pushing this method, we didn't need to engage the messy variants of race, class, gender, and sexuality. The poem, we were told by Wimsatt and Beardsley and others, is primary. All other material is extraneous. And I found this bewildering in grad school. I really did. I just had no idea what we were actually doing. Challenges arose to this formalist pursuit of beauty, according to Bruce, and in the process, new motives emerged for criticism writ large. For Bruce, these motives had to do with politics in some way, but for me, I feel that he's never quite explicit about what politics and what ways. As we all know, in the wake of the 60s, some critics sought to expose the white and middle class power that the university both represented and consolidated. You can think of various histories of the novel by Nancy Armstrong and others that do exactly that. Others insisted that relations must be crafted in terms of communities beyond the university, to which I'll return later. Still others insisted that the literary has to share space with other cultural objects that perform different work in the society at large. Many people sought to link critique to larger political struggles, and as critical race theory, queer theory, and Black studies emerged as forceful currents in English departments, new generations dug in again to an argument with those forceful currents about formalism and disinterested engagement. And so the stage is sort of set for a standoff between the formalists and the disinterested people, and the people who emerge out of the programs that Amanda is calling advocacy programs, but that I will just call radical political currents of thought. Bruce pays really careful attention to these histories of criticism and offers insightful notes on close reading, historically specific readings, histories of the impact of race and class and sexuality and gender upon those readings, and accounts of shifts in power as a consequence. But the history of critique isn't all that he comes to offer. This is a polemic, and in many ways it is aimed firmly at the present day. And for evidence of that, just look at the debates that Bruce is now having with John Guillory in the pages of the Chronicle and elsewhere. This is clearly about who are we now? What are we to become? What should the critic do? Criticism and politics, in a way, as much as it's a polemic, it's also a defense of critique from those who are intent upon replacing it, and a defense of the version of criticism in which he believes, and that is not completely different from the versions that he was taught when he was in college. Now, the person who he most vigorously opposes in this polemic, as we've just heard, is Rita Felski. Thank you, Bruce, who, in the limits of critique and elsewhere, has made a career out of passive-aggressively asking for the terms of engagement in literary studies to shift from questions about power to questions about love. Why passive-aggressive? Because people who want to talk about love are actually talking about power. They're just doing it in a softer voice to make it sound nice. So Robbins' decimation of Felski, he calls her analyses political correctness baiting, are more than welcome. But Bruce's book is at the same time a defense of certain forms of expertise, certain canons of knowledge, and at some level, a defense of progress, of getting somewhere, of optimistic building, of new forms of governing, of English, of world literature, and most importantly, of the relevance of the critic. Now, inevitably, in this narrative, there are heroes and there are goats. The goats include Felski, more love, less criticism. Weichi Dimmock collapses radically distinct histories into one unified narrative. Michel Foucault, no political solutions, only critique, and only a sense of not wanting to be governed like that. Heroes include Matthew Arnold, surprisingly to me, Fred Jameson, less surprising, Lionel Trilling, Edward Said, Stuart Hall, and no surprise, the darling of cisgender lefties, Andrea Longchu. The other characters in the narrative, I'll return to that. It's not just a little bomb. We'll get that. The other characters in the narrative, and this is a narrative, it's a good story. It really is. It's a compelling story that Bruce tells, step forward every now and then from I think a kind of unfortunate catch-all category, women and minorities. Women and minorities, he tells us, have been asked to suppress their specific differences in order to meet the aesthetics demand of universality, which is why you can't have disinterestedness there. And then again, women and minorities make up a new set of political agents ready to contest the proper objects of literary study. And then again, women and minorities push for greater academic representation or serve as rebels, banging at the gates of cultural literacy, demanding to be included. Now, this is in keeping with the story that Robbins wants to tell us about the push away from traditional critique towards new versions. But unfortunately, for this reader at least, the people gathered under the heading of women and minorities never make a meaningful impact on this category of criticism itself. They offer the charges of elitism. They propose the changes to the canon in order to change the whole politics of representation. They insist loudly, militantly, and successfully that we must change the university. Women and minorities, we learn, are in fact the very agents of change, of the change that Bruce is describing. And yet they never enter the narrative as critics. They are not the critics in the genealogical order that unfolds throughout the book. Let's take two examples in case that seems a little bit too broad. One, Hortense Spillers. Spillers steps out of the portmanteau of women and minorities a few times. First, when Bruce is making an argument about what an expanded canon can look like and can do, he very sensibly mentions James Baldwin's fight with Richard Wright over how Black existence should enter into representation in order to signal that these fights and debates are not simply about what should be in the canon, but about modes of representation themselves and what orders they presume. But he writes in relationship to this, rather than reporting with strident outrage a violation of one's own identity, criticism's dominant sensibility, as I see it, prefers to look at one's own identity from the outside, to add another collectivity's set of eyes and explore the more complex view that emerges from this extra level of scrutiny. As in what? as when Hortense Spillers adds gender to race in Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, or when Laura Kipnis adds class to gender in her account of Hustler, or when Spivak adds imperialism to class and gender in 3 women's texts and a critique of imperialism. I'm not sure that any of these critics would understand themselves to be adding anything to anything. And this description, and this is the problem with this idea that women and minorities are simply asking for something to be added to the order that will stay the same, but that things will be added to it. Spillers, after all, was not adding anything to anything. She was asking after form, an American grammar, which makes it impossible for Black bodies to even enter into the frame of gender. So it's not adding gender and race to something. There's a question of whether gender is actually operable in relationship to the Black body under the conditions of white supremacy. Spiller's argument, which emerges from a complex and dense and utterly compelling piece of critique, is not that we should add gender to our account of race when thinking about Oedipus' desire in the Black family, but rather that the decimation of the Black family by slavery and its afterlife has resulted in distinctions between flesh and body, imagined in actual castration, between making up selves in bourgeois society and the cultural unmaking of Black bodies under the conditions of slavery and after. Later, Spillers again emerges, asking the question, what is the obligation, she says, of white intellectuals to their people? In response to and this is in response to the repeated insistence that the role of the Black critic should be to respond to and represent a Black community. Robbins takes this as an opportunity to expand upon the role of the organic intellectual, and this leads to some thought of class, but there's no deep engagement with the question of how and why, in fact, white critics are constantly responding to their own constituencies, but without being charged of identity politics or the politics of grievance and so on. And this is really important because the narrative that Bruce is telling about white guys defending the best and the brightest, sparring with women and minorities who want to do away with Homer and other classics, apparently, and passing on from one generation to the next the mantle of critic, from Arnold to Trilling to Robbins, is nothing if not an identity narrative. And it is bristling too with a sense of grievance and anxiety about the potential passing of an era in which they were central, to which they might be in the future gathering under headings like men and white minorities. Second person who I would have brought into the narrative in a really different way is Rod Ferguson. Ferguson seems like a prime candidate for the model of critic of the future. He is a trained sociologist. He turned away from the kind of data collection that was carried out by people like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the real target of Spiller's critique in Mama's Baby, and read instead the archive of Black women's fiction and criticism of the 20th century, saying that that was an archive that gave better insight into the conditions of Black life and Black queer life in North America. After his landmark book, A Critique of Sociology, Aberrations in Black, he, like Bruce, turns to the university and tracks the rise of a new form of power, an administrative and institutionalizing power that first identifies and then marks and then finally mimics the very processes by which radical social movements challenge and confront oppressive forms of rule. Now, Robbins turns to Ferguson only to ask why women and minorities, having been granted the access to the university that they asked for, use it only to articulate a new melancholic critique of the institution. This is the passage. Ferguson's Foucauldianism gives an individual twist to a structure of feeling that is much more broadly shared, the unhappy assurance that the institutional recognition of ethnic minorities must be what the institution wants and what the dark powers behind the institution want, rather than what the minorities themselves wanted. Though many of their members will recall that once upon a time, they did want something much like what they got, if also more of it than that, and that they had to overcome serious resistance in order to get it, end quote. This is a massive compression of Ferguson's contribution. His chapters on student movements of the 60s and 70s line up nicely with Bruce's. The particular struggles of students of color at UCSD in the 70s, the racial genealogy of excellence, generational struggle, immigration, and sexuality detail the various ways in which power, working in an affirmative mode, as we've learned from Foucault, co-opts oppositional forms and transform them in the university from modes of dissenting difference into reduced narratives about inclusion. Women and minorities want to be in the canon. It is this narrative by Ferguson and Spillers' narrative about grammars of racial representation that are poorly served when they're shoved under the heading of women and minorities and discussed as if Spillers and Ferguson are asking for more women and more minorities to be admitted to the party, when in fact both critics are proposing the party's over. The guests have gone home. They are on their way to a completely different event, off campus, and where there will be dancing or something. So moving towards a conclusion, I think we can ask, and I want to ask, what does Bruce want? This is a reasonable question by the end of the book. Does he just want women and minorities to be pleased and stop with the grievances? Quote, "There is no doubt that groups with a grievance are now much better represented in the discipline than they were half a century ago. To be precise, they are participating in the university's governance. What began as a rebellion," he says, "is now an administration." That's Rod's point. That's Rod Ferguson's point. End quote. Does he want us to all get along and join forces on behalf of figuring out a better future for democracy? Sort of. But what democracy? Run by whom? What better forms of governance does he imagine? How would these forms be bolstered and supported by the continued practices of the critics, which by the end of the book and in the absence of real engagement of the works of queers and people of color look remarkably like the old ones? Bruce ends with Stuart Hall, to whom he attributes a sense that the world needs to be governed differently. But Hall should have been the beginning. We should have begun with Hall, not ended with him. Hall is just the beginning of new forms of critique that have animated the university since the 1960s. That Bruce ends with Hall indicates some kind of unwillingness to recognize that while he and John Guillory and Mark Leela duke it out in the mainstream organs of intellectual life, saying critique is political. Well, it shouldn't be. It's too political. It's not political enough. It's only political because of these identity politics, kids. It's dead. It's alive. It's living dead. It's well. It's good. In the meantime, critique has moved on. It is indeed alive and kicking. In Denise Ferreira de Silva's new book, Unpayable Debt, for example, where a reading of Octavia Butler's speculative novel Kindred opens onto commentary about subprime mortgages and black debt. In this book, Ferreira de Silva gives us an example of what critique could be now. She activates what she calls, quote, "the negative capacity that the captive body has gifted Blackness, which is to bring out the juridical, to disarrange the symbolic and its constructs such as nature and world, and to bring the ethical into the figuring of the economic that informs our critiques of state and capital." She gives a beautiful reading of Kindred in the way in which Dana passes back and forth through the wall of her home in LA, traveling back in time to pay a debt that is not hers to pay, having to decide to save the life of the white slave owner who becomes her ancestor. And at the end of her journey, she leaves part of her arm in the wall, fusing the black body with property in a way that signals the ruination to come. This ongoing process of disarranging the symbolic is an enduring contribution to radical thought and a major innovation in critique. Or we could end with Saidiya Hartman's indelible contributions to Black poesis, her experiments with beauty and rebellion, formal as they are. Or we could turn to the Undercommons, a really big deal missing text in this book, with its deeply influential critique of the university, with its cadre of professionals and professional critics, and its critical education built out of, quote, theft, the conquest, the negligence of the outcast mass intellectuality of the Undercommons, the real organic intellectuals. The Undercommons don't care about the future of critique. They are that future. The Undercommons don't want to read the canon of conquest, the lineage of geniuses, the masked texts with their masterful methods and techniques. The Undercommons want more. Moten and Harney write, the Undercommons might by contrast be understood as wary of critique, weary of it, and at the same time dedicated to the collectivity of its future, the collectivity that may come to be its future. Bruce is a bit too distracted by Andrea Long Chu's critique of women, for example, to see that what it replaces was Valerie Solanas' critique of men, just as one example. He's too reverent of Arnold and Trilling, too concerned with Guillory and Leela. I don't know why people are so high on this Guillory book. Let's discuss. To engage with the university and its professionals, to attend to the undercommons. But that's where the action is, where the thought is happening, where change is being made by young queer thinkers, mostly people of color, who will not be satisfied with a new mode of governance, who want nothing, who want everything, and who want it now. Thank you.
Okay, I'm really grateful to Jack and Amanda for putting such serious thought into this book of mine. I'm a little dazzled by how much serious thought they put into it, and certainly very honored, both of you. Wow. I'm going to call my mother as soon as I get home. These very smart people had all these things to say. I don't know what to say about them, but so Jack, working backwards, I think I would never, on the basis of my skill set and generational placement, try to point a finger at where the action is. I'll leave that to youngsters like you. I was waiting for you to say that. Anyway, it's just not something I would be good at if I tried to do it. So I didn't try to do it. Right? I mean, I'm very happy to leave that to others. And if it inspires people like you to say, this is where I think the action is, great, because I knew I wasn't doing that. I'm not going to apologize for ending with Stuart Hall, rather than beginning with Stuart Hall. In some ways, he's still, his memory is an admonition to people. I fixate a little bit more than I should, maybe, on this one moment in a cultural studies conference in which he's asked whether the way he's talking suggests that he actually believes in progress. And he says, now that you mention it, I do. And I think that's a difference between feeling that you belong to a movement and feeling that you're making a career. I mean, Stuart Hall never wrote anything without feeling that what he was doing was for a movement, right? I mean, he almost never signed a piece of writing on his own without collaborating with people. I mean, institutionally and individually. It's like he just always talked and thought like, I'm doing this for a reason which is not institutional, and it's not, it's certainly not my career. Now, I mean, I think about as much about my career as anybody. It's not that. Just I admire Stuart Hall for establishing what I think would be a very useful standard, even if intermittently, that we could kind of apply to what we do, just to, to say there are bigger things at stake than getting published or, getting a promotion or whatever it is. I mean, there's a lot at stake. And I don't think there's anybody quite like Stuart Hall from that point of view, at least in my experience. So, I thought, yep, that is definitely where I want this to end, and I think to connect this back to Gramsci and organic intellectuals and traditional intellectuals, one of the things that Guillory said to me is that academics are traditional intellectuals, they're not organic. And one of the things I thought about that is, yeah, and like traditional intellectuals, the way Gramsci describes them, that is we, our first move is to think of ourselves as independent and autonomous, not belonging anywhere. which is a mistake, according to Gramsci, even for traditional intellectuals, because they kind of serve interests that they're not saying they serve. And I've found in my experience, and if you ask yourselves, I mean, you may think the same thing, that one thing you're up against, if you do talk politics explicitly in an academic setting, is people kind of pull back. That's not who we are. We are autonomous. We are independent. Don't talk to me about all that stuff that comes from outside, right? Well, it's real. That, I mean, it's not a surprise, I suppose, institutionally, that that's a fact about the institutional space that we inhabit. So yeah, that's kind of what I was pushing back against. I think it's a real thing to push back against. I also think that, yes, it's a defense of the profession, because I think that, there's a lot of feeling that's kind of on my side in this. That's one of the reasons why I couldn't be more belligerent. I was thinking, I think, people sort of agree with me to, maybe a surprising extent, to a pleasant extent. Anyway, what else do I want to say? Really quickly about adding. Jack, this is for you. So, adding gender, I mean, of course, it's a very crude, clunky metaphor. But when I read Gayatri Spivak on Three Women's Texts and a Critique of Imperialism, I think she's arguing with Gilbert and Gubar and an established kind of liberal feminist reading of Jane Eyre. And she's saying, you gotta think about imperialism. You're not thinking about imperialism. You gotta think about class. You're not thinking about class. Add those things. Add. Okay. It's not like Spillers said to herself, oh my God, I'm a woman also. She just, sort of saying that when you talk about race, you sort of have to talk about gender also. So adding is a clunky metaphor, but anyway, I think it got the job done in the book, and other people can refine it. What do I want to say in response to you, Amanda? Something very, very quick, actually. I remember when you were no, not at all. On the contrary, were insisting that Foucault was a crypto-normativist. You were saying this, right? Yeah, you weren't the first, but you said it very emphatically and with your usual passion and clarity. Anyway, and I remember resisting a little bit, and then little by little, my resistance just dissolved. And I thought, Amanda is right about this. And I'm going to come out of the closet as a normativist myself. And this has happened in large part, thanks to you. And I recently taught the sort of What is Critique essay by Foucault, in which he says, critique means not wanting to be governed like that, with a deictic, in other words, pointing at how he doesn't want to be governed, but unwilling to put in any words what he doesn't want, because to put it in words would be to provide the standard by which it's judged, the norm by which it's judged, so that he would be, in fact, governing simply by laying out the norm by which he's criticizing what he's criticizing. And I thought to myself, okay, I've had it with that, and even if democracy is not the ideal term here, and of course it's not, I only say it in the sense that it's something that, needs to be democratized. So what do I want? I certainly want a democratizing of democracy, an extension of democracy, geographically and socially. I mean, as somebody who's been talking about cosmopolitanism forever, one of the things I think is that you don't have a democracy if the people you're bombing don't get to vote on whether they're being bombed, on whether they should be bombed. So, you get that. Anyway. Okay, that's enough.
Thank you. Just happy to start. I also want to ask a question about something you just said, Bruce, but I just wanted to offer as a comment. Forgive me for this, but Amanda, you were talking a lot about the humanities, but most of what I heard was really about literary critics. And I'm just kind of curious as to whether this is actually about the humanities as a bigger, because there are a lot of people in the humanities who don't work on texts and they're not critics in that sense. So that's just kind of a question as to whether that's an actual slippage or that's really what you're aiming at. But the question I wanted to ask Bruce is, in your comments just now about Hall, you were saying that part of what you admire is the ability to be not professional, not aiming for publication, to be perhaps forgotten in that way. And I was thinking a lot about, I'm working on this right now. I have a student in a class where we're struggling through this together about literature that wants to be political and is willing to be didactic, not always very subtle. In fact, intentionally not subtle, maybe forgotten when the issue that it's covering is resolved or is no longer on people's minds. And I just wondered if, we've talked a little bit about this before, if you see this as some of what you're advocating as being really about professional criticism primarily, or whether there's a kind of literary analog to it as well, that the literature that is not concerned with standing the test of time and being subtle and being interior, and being in that sense kind of only complicatedly political. So that's the question.
Let's see. First of all, I probably really am talking about literary criticism a lot more than the humanities. I thought that somehow by leading with Foucault, and because Foucault is so important to so many other disciplines, I would get some resonance in other disciplines, but really otherwise it is about literary criticism. Very quick thing, I actually use the word professional in a much more positive sense than most people who share my politics. That is, I don't think that we have to be ashamed about thinking of ourselves as professional and trying to be professional. I would not say that Stuart Hall was unprofessional at all. I mean, I think he was professional in a very positive sense of professional. That's part of my polemic with Guillory, actually. And the final thing, this may be not exactly what you have in mind, but one of my personal weaknesses as a critic is and this is a reason why I'm such a defender of Fredric Jameson. I'm not sort of so good on my political allies in literature. I mean, I'm much better on Dostoevsky, whose politics I hate, right? So I do a kind of a Jameson on Dostoevsky, sort of finding politically interesting things that are not there in his explicit politics. Now that's just, I don't say it's the only way people should be. I mean, it would be a mistake, obviously, but I've always admired Jameson for doing that kind of thing, for being the opposite of a name caller, right? I mean, he's not interested in pointing the finger at people and saying, you're this or that or the other thing. He's always kind of looking under the surface, if I may say, for more interesting things that are happening, elsewhere. And somebody as great as Dostoevsky, who has loathsome politics, if you ask him, the books are really great and politically very interesting, partly because they don't just express his loathsome politics, right? So, I mean, the negative side of that is that I'm not so good when people agree with me politically. Like, great, and then I have nothing to say. I have nothing, I can't get any credit. Whereas with somebody, I really don't agree with politically, there are points to be scored.
Hi, thank you so much. I mean, all of you for that. And I just have a really quick question. I was trying to think about this, like, what is there enduring, or obviously context specific, but I'd like to know what each of you think about the category and concept of detachment Is there room for it? I mean, I'm talking, is it, I mean, this is something which is historically, I'm going to tell you this, but historically associated with the virtue, or identified as a signal virtue of the critic, this, that, and the other, that disposition, going back to your Arnold, et cetera. So that's one question. The other question this is sort of a mischievous question, and this has to do with the object, yeah. Exactly. But well, let me just start with that. Let me just start with attachment. No, I won't babble on. Yeah. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to ask was, and this actually, Jack, I was thinking about this with reference to your reply, and I was thinking maybe what would matter here, what would help here, would be T.S. Eliot's the tradition of the individual talent. That would be a way of not just adding on, right? In other words, Eliot's formulation is once this new poet, once this new subject is cast into the whatever, they change it unalterably. They change, the object is no longer the same object, right? Which led me to wonder about the notion of, forgive me for putting it this way, but a unified a field. Is there a field now where we are all in the same room together? That's my question. And when I say all, I mean the old white men and the rest of us. Are we all in a room together? And what does that room look like now? So that's my thing.
Well, detachment, it's a lovely idea, right? But people are almost never detached. And so it's a performance detachment. And it actually, what I'm saying here is it masks an identity politics that never gets called. Yeah.
So you would say detachment is always already roots.
I think it's, Denise de Silva calls it the transparent eye, which is the eye, which is part of factored into the metaphysics of subjectivity, that there be a transparency that then feeds into this idea that, well, this isn't my fight, but I'm just here laying out the principles.
You and Amanda talked about it, because of course, I mean, in other words, the aspiration to a detachment, the notion of detachment as a regulative norm, et cetera, none of that for you. Like for you, it's just always just a mask of power.
Well, it's not just that's not how power works. It isn't just masked and then there's a real thing, right? It's an incredibly cunning procedure, right, in the way that Povinelli puts it. Yeah. And so that power can go about its business without people feeling as if they're being manipulated. So yeah, so the ruse of detachment, I mean, it's not interesting to look at. Can we all be in a room? We are all in a room together. It's just that some people read some people and some people don't read other people. It's not a matter of just saying like, oh, Bruce, you should read the young people. It's just that the action isn't all with Guillory. Do you know, even though the Chronicle thinks it is, and even though the London Review of Books thinks it is,
partly with Guillory.
maybe,
Right.
but there are a lot of other things out there that are doing something different. And yet when when Bruce squares off with Guillory, you wouldn't know about all of those other things that are part of the vitality, in fact, of the field of English.
Except, well, I mean, I don't see it that way. In other words, it seems to me that what you're suggesting is that no room for Guillory anymore, that because Guillory and those people, oh, okay.
There's so much room. He's got so much room. His book is reviewed everywhere.
Right.
Nobody needs to worry about whether there's room for Guillory. There are mansions for Guillory.
Right.
The question is, some of the other currents of the field could actually answer the question of whether this is a dead field. And we could focus on them and we would find out it is not at all dead.
Right. Although you have to take out Guillory's critique, full throttle, which is that it is dead, right? So anyway, I don't mean to go on.
Okay, so, critique relies upon detachment. There are many forms of detachment. Irony is a form of detachment. Irony is a great performative tool and practice of many people who want to upend ruses of power. So detachments, I don't think it's inherently good or bad. But I do think many really important practices require an aspiration to it. And I don't, so that's just, what I would say about detachment. On this other question, I just kind of have an observation to make, which is that, yeah, we're all in the same room, but we're not all in the same room. And one thing that I'm really, really struck by toward the end of your response, which was so powerful, you know, your use of the word thinkers and your description of certain practices that themselves are kind of, at least in the description, refusing a distinction between critic and politics because they are actualizing it through thinking or a kind of hybrid creative practice in the case of Saidiya Hartman. And that I think is super interesting. But then I also think about how there's a really strong investment among many scholars in the humanities at present for co-creation of research, for, you know, going out to the community, for like radically changing how we even do research. And those were some of the things that I, you know, was thinking about too, sort of like after I finished Bruce's book. But I don't, this is just it's just an observation, but it's just like a very different kind of form. And it's not, and the thinking and the creativity as a kind of immediate actualization could itself be a little bit romanticized. In other words, the idea that that is somehow doing something like immediately. So that's all. Yeah. You want to say something about detachment?
Yeah. Rita Felsky says very nice things about me in her the book The Limits of Critique, because I come out and saying, you know, something like, nobody's really as detached as they think they are, that we're all really attached, and we should kind of fess up to, and I kind of needed to say that because I had been very, very taken with Edward Said's sort of model of the intellectual as an extremely detached, like, you know, absolutely detached figure. And I had to sort of think that through, and, you know, Edward, maybe it's true for you. Actually, it's not even true for you. You know, there is no such thing as that. That, you know, that said, I certainly think that a critique and a certain kind or degree of detachment go together. And I would, you know, I'm really scared of people who are trying to close down that whole operation, right? So I'm against.
Hi. So, sorry, initially, I haven't read the book, so I don't really know a lot of. I guess my question is whether or not this dispute is rather about post-functional and pre-post-functional modes of literary criticism, and whether or not is this a critique on post-functionalism, whereas kind of we're in it and that's part of the literary process, or is it, can we remove ourselves from that kind of, I don't know what you'd say about that.
It's not a term I use. You'd have to kind of explain to me what it means.
I think I'm referencing a encyclopedia excerpt from on post-functionalism on the rhetorical use of kind of situating an argument as part of the argument itself. So the position of the argument is the functional aspect of it, I guess. I'm definitely butchering post-functionalism by a long stretch, but whether or not the dispute of being radical and kind of oppositionary is also at the same time a critique on the differences between post-functionalism identity and positioning within an argument, and a critique of a literary text. Can someone, I guess, to the detachment point, can someone remove themselves from the critique, and to what extent? I guess is that the argument of the book. I don't. That's more so what I was going to ask is, what is the argument of the book exactly?
You asked me what the argument of the book is. Well, how much time do you have? No, I don't know what post-functionalism, and I still don't know after, I'm sorry. But I promise I will look it up, okay? Because it sounds intriguing. And if you'll tell me which encyclopedia, I'll go straight there.
In the incredible firepower of this panel, I hardly dare to even open my mouth. But I remember back to your my first encounter with your work was your critique of Edward Said and his outspoken rejection of professionalism. And I'd just like to, it was in Diacritics, 83 possibly. And I'm just wondering, how has your view oh, apologies to you who were not born, but I was, and and I'd just like to know, I mean, there was a raging debate prosecuted by Stanley Fish and others at that moment. And I'm just wondering whether your own views on professionalism have progressed or transformed or evolved.
Yeah, I mean, I remember your role in the Stanley Fish professionalism stuff, because anyway. I don't think so. I haven't been thinking about it very much, to be honest. It's really only, I shouldn't say this, the fact that I wrote this book, and it came out in September, and a couple of months later, John Guillory's book came out, and suddenly everyone in the world was talking about John Guillory's book. And kind of, I thought, I'm going to have to sort of go back to this old argument about professionalism that I made, which of course nobody knows about except you. Even my mother has forgotten that I made this argument, and I told her about it. Yeah, I mean, I'll just say I've been called on the issue. That is a kind of a serious left-wing critic on the West Coast said, it's a version. So my argument about professionalism, very, very quickly, is professions actually survive only not by being completely self-enclosed, but by addressing sort of publics outside themselves. And what the person on the West Coast said to me at MLA was, if you imagine yourself addressing the donors, then it's going to screw up your politics forever. You're going to be so limited in what you think and what you do. And I stage a little scene, because it was a scene from my graduate education, in which the famous professor running the first year colloquium said, what do you say if a businessman holds a gun to your head and says, why study literature? I mean, I say this in the book. And it was very traumatic, like, oh my God, what am I going to say? Well, that got me, in a way, I never stopped thinking, trying to answer that question. And the book is partly, answer to that question. And what I was being told was, stop trying to answer that question, and you'll sort of do better work. I don't know, you'll be more fun to read than you are. I don't know, something like that. But it's true that I really have never stopped trying to answer it, because my view, I mean, first of all, I want to defend the fact that we are professionals, and I want to, talk to the conditions of being professional, which involve that kind of discourse, a kind of legit, awkward as it is. So yeah, that's the best I can do. I haven't gone, I have nothing new to say on the subject. That's the old.
Very interesting when you talked about, I think something like the performance and detachment it perhaps isn't, it's not detachment or not, right? What are the modalities of attachment? What are the forces that inscribe in it? And I was just thinking as the last thought that Gramsci, we know for the, a concept of the intellectual as a attached, but engaged attached. And when he sits down to think about writing his chapter on the intellectuals, he says, I have to be detached, excuse me. He says, für ewig, I'm doing this forever, which doesn't sound very Gramscian, but he says, I've been writing hundreds of articles about the workers' movement in Turin, and now I need to be detached in order to think about the history of attachment and organic intellectuals. He's kind of
detached him by putting him in prison, right? I mean,
also saying, even in prison, where I'm necessarily detached, I need to just step back now, and I need to do something because I may rot in jail. So I need to really do this carefully and extremely analytically, and take a step back from my own attachment as a communist leader. It's just an interesting kind of mix of elements that are there.
We have stayed past our time, and thank you everyone for this vibrant conversation, and congratulations, Bruce, on the book. And thank you, Jack and Amanda.
thanks everybody for coming.